Hey everybody, this is chapter 1 of Dirk Braunstein's Adorno's Critique of Political Economy. Chapter 1 is titled Attempting a Critique of Political Economy. So let's party. Quote, each of the chapters is decorated ... with a motto, and as always, these are weighty words of famous men, end quote. Hanna Lure Schlafer, Eine Träne für den Vater. Quote, Adorno, that's the end of the quote. Quote, Adorno was not bothered with political economy, end quote, claims Jürgen Habermas, when in fact the opposite is true. In the dialectical imagination, Martin J. deploys the same stereotype, writing that, quote, Horkheimer and Adorno, however broad the scope of their interest and knowledge, were never really seriously students of economics, Marxist or otherwise, end quote. Setting aside the question of what it means to qualify as a serious student or critic of economics, it is true that, quote, in private conversation, Adorno made no secret of his aversion to dealing with the economy, end quote. After all, as Jürgen Ritzert notes, quote, economics were certainly not his thing, end quote. Yet Karl Marx himself, not an economist, also made no secret of his aversion to dealing with, quote, economic stuff, end quote. Economische Scheiße. Is that shit? I don't know. I guess it's stuff, but... Anyway, indeed, for Adorno, quote, the genius of Marx consisted precisely in the fact that, filled with disgust, Marx tackled exactly what he found disgusting, the economy, end quote, Adorno. Oh, there's a footnote here. Letter from Marx to Engels, 2nd of April, 1851. Translator's note. Although the German Scheiße is not as vulgar as the English, quote, shit, some of the pathos is lost in this translation from the Marx-Engels collected works, as this passage can indeed also be translated as, quote, economic shit, end quote. And footnote. Quote, people who champion critical theory, end quote, Adorno claims in a seminar from 1968, quote, should not let the predominance of the economic deter them from attempting a critique of political economy, end quote. 1 year later, Irving Fetcher reports, Adorno, quote, betrayed to a student that the study of economy simply repelled him, but that he also knew the critique of political economy would have to be the basis of a revolutionary theory and practice which invokes Marx, end quote. Irving Fetcher. I have a book by Irving Fetcher on the channel if you're interested. Having said that, the present study is about neither Marx nor Marx's critique of political economy, nor is it primarily concerned with Adorno's reception of Marx, which will be referred to only insofar as is necessary to reproduce the genuinely Adornian critique of political economy. That this critique exists, and that one misses the best it has to offer by measuring it simply against the Marxian critique of political economy, is the central thesis of this study, which aims to depict the shape, goals, and course of development of Adorno's critique. Indication is the predominant gesture of this study for two reasons. First, the difficulties encountered by Adorno in attaining an adequate understanding of the critique of political economy cannot be erased with witty paraphrases which simply recapitulate them. As such, Adorno will be directly quoted whenever possible. Second, many of the materials supporting the notion of a specifically Adornian critique of political economy, specifically Adornian critique of economy, have until now remained unpublished and thus largely unknown. These materials include numerous sketches, remarks, and at times also quotations and references which only assume the contours of a critique of economy when contextualized and interpreted. Hence, Adorno's critique of political economy can only exist as, quote, secondary literature, end quote. The fact that Adorno himself never attempted or even planned to issue this critique in, for example, the form of a monograph cannot simply be attributed to a feeling of incompetence in economics proper, but rather must also be viewed as a result of the pronounced tendency of his critique of political economy to evade systematic exposition. As far as is possible, Adorno's own work remains free of an explicit critique of economy. What Adorno offers his readers is almost exclusively the result of his own thinking, minus insight into this thinking itself. Footnote. An exception to this rule is negative dialectics, in which Adorno announces that he, quote, to the best of his ability, means to put his cards on the table, end quote. Adorno. Bracing himself accordingly for the reactions, Adorno adds that he, quote, feels no rancor and does not begrudge the joy of those in either camp who will proclaim that they knew it all the time and now he was confessing, end quote. Adorno. End footnote. It goes without saying that there is no Adorno the economist to be rediscovered. Yet there is certainly a critic of political economy who in many respects goes beyond Marx, even while often lagging behind Marx's economic subject knowledge. In any case, Adorno was never under any illusions regarding the importance of economy to the functioning of the wrong society. Footnote. Translator's note, quote, wrong society, end quote. Felsche Gesellschaft recalls Adorno's oft-quoted saying, quote, es gibt kein richtiges Leben im Falschen, end quote. Adorno. Was it one cannot live right in a false society? I don't know. There's a continues on. While the standard translation of this passage by Edmund Jeffcott reads, quote, wrong life cannot be lived rightly, end quote. Dennis Redmond's translation at Marxist.org, quote, there is no right life in the wrong one, end quote, is syntactically closer to the original. Alternatively, recalling the millennia-old philosophical concern with, quote, the good life, end quote, Rodney Livingstone's translation of Problems of Moral Philosophy renders this saying as, quote, there can be no good life within the bad one, end quote. End footnote. Quote, the categories of the critique of political economy form, the constantly present, although rarely visible substrate upon which the Adornian critique of political economy takes place, end quote. Virger Denitza, 1996. As Rolf Johannes notes, although the critique of economy is central for Adorno, the critique of economy is a center which is almost completely omitted. Footnote. Johannes's central thesis is that Adorno, quote, in Adorno's works from the post-war period took aim at the economic critique at the center of materialist theory, end quote, but rarely took it up as a specific theme. Quote, what Adorno developed was a critical theory with the center left out, end quote. And, quote, with the concept of constellation, end quote, Adorno's negative dialectics, quote, formulates almost a methodology of critical theory with the center left out, end quote. Johannes, 1995. However, this assumption rests on a misunderstanding. The, quote, methodology that Johannes claims to recognize does not derive from a method which would constitute, quote, a singularly necessary consequence if critical theoretical work were no longer organized according to the Horkheimian institutional idea, end quote. Johannes. After all, the center of a constellation is not left out due to theoretical or institutional deficiencies, but rather because it cannot be named conceptually without thereby being destroyed. At its center is not something related to the economy, but rather an epistemological antinomy. End footnote. Indeed, as extensive as Adorno's work is, Adorno's work contains very few explicit engagements with the critique of political economy. These occur first in the posthumously published, quote, Reflections on Class Theory, of the piece Reflections on Class Theory, then in Adorno's contribution to the so-called positivism dispute, and finally in the piece Late Capitalism or Industrial Society, Adorno's opening address to the 16th German Sociological Congress in 1968. For this reason, notes from Adorno's lectures and transcripts from his seminars will be referred to throughout this book. These sources reveal, quote, how intensively... Wait, is that... No, that's a... Is that a quote or dirt? Quote... These sources reveal, quote, how intensively Adorno must have engaged with the Marxian critique of political economy. The Marxian texts were permanent points of reference, bracket, in his seminars, in bracket, and communicating the basic categories of the critique of political economy must have been one of Adorno's main concerns, end quote. Grigat, 2007. I have a lot of pieces from Stefan Grigat on this channel if you're interested. Historical Materialism series should translate his book. For his own part, Adorno discusses the pitfalls associated with the notion of, quote, concern, Anliegen, not in a seminar transcript, but in the jargon of authenticity, end footnote. From the mid-1950s onward, transcripts from Adorno's seminars, some of which were co-taught with Horkheimer, were regularly taken down by participants and archived at the Institute for Social Research. Footnote: at the time of the present study, the transcripts were located in the Social Sciences Library of the Goethe University of Frankfurt, and it is here where they were accessed. Since then, they have been relocated to the university's archive, where, as a, quote, discovery, they are finally getting the attention they deserve. In the archive, the, quote, sociological minutes from Adorno's seminars are listed in a stock overview. The complete minutes from Adorno's seminars from 1949 to 1969 have been published in a series of 4 volumes, edited by the author of the present study, Braunstein. End footnote. Some of these transcripts have already been... end footnote. Where am I? Some of these transcripts have already been analyzed by Alex Demirovich, I think that's how you pronounce that guy's name, in a chapter on the Frankfurt School's, quote, teaching practice, end quote, from his German language monograph on the Frankfurt School, Der Nonkonformistische Intellektuelle, the nonconformist intellectual. On the question of the relationship between his spontaneous utterances and written work, Adorno stated unambiguously that it would be, quote, impossible to make something printed out of a free improvisation unless the standards involved were lower than mine, end quote. Quote, as much as I know about their mediation, I keep the genres strictly separate, and I mean not without reason, end quote, Adorno. That being said, for the purpose of the present study, both, quote, genres appear indispensable. Quote, we have nothing else, end quote, one wants to say, also a quotation from one of the, quote, unauthorized texts, end quote, namely, from the transcript of a conversation between Adorno and Horkheimer from 1956, as Horkheimer reciprocates Adorno's comment that they, quote, must not abandon Marxist terminology, end quote. When Adorno's grasp of economy is called into question, Marxian theory is invariably presented as the benchmark against which Adorno's social critique must be measured. Every deviation is pedantically marked up as false, or at least as a vulgar misunderstanding in order ultimately to portray Adorno as the victim of a naive fallacy. Answering the question of the nature of Adorno's theoretical relationship to Marx from Marx's perspective, a widespread assumption is affirmed that Adorno for the most part simply came up short in his critique of political economy. The sparse amount of secondary literature which takes Adorno seriously as a critic of economy at all hardly contradicts this view. Yet for his own part, Adorno was less scrupulous when it came to further developing or even modifying or abandoning Marxian theorems. This can be seen in Adorno's response to Herbert Marcuse's essay on existentialism, in which he takes particular issue with Marcuse's claims that, quote, Insofar as existentialism is a doctrine, existentialism remains an idealistic doctrine. Existentialism hypostatizes specific historical conditions of human existence into ontological and metaphysical characteristics, end quote. Marcuse. And that quote, and that existentialism, quote, thus becomes part of the very ideology which existentialism attacks, and existentialism's radicalism is illusory, end quote. Marcuse. Writing to Marcuse, Adorno points out that, quote, it gives too much credit to the bourgeois concept of philosophy, end quote, to offhandedly equate, quote, all philosophy of thinking in invariance with ontologism, end quote. Adorno. Regarding this equation, Adorno poses the following question, quote, I know it is good Marx, but is it also true, end quote. Adorno. The present study consists of 3 parts. By and large, these are structured chronologically in order to trace the development of Adorno's critique of economy within Adorno's philosophy. Generally, biographical narrative and character. The first part takes up the question of how Adorno arrives at his critique of economy in the first place. As will become apparent, it is primarily through Adorno's study of Georg Lukács's writings, as well as his engagement with Walter Benjamin, and to a lesser extent Alfred Sohn Rethel, that chapter 3, that Adorno comes to the conviction that society can only be conceptualized with the help of economic categories. Having appropriated these categories, Adorno is led at the end of the 1930s to apply these categories explicitly for the first time as part of his own philosophy, which at the time was already pursuing socio-critical goals. Adorno's American exile not only constitutes a caesura in his biography, but also in the development of his critique of economy. The second part of this work explores the debate concerning the concept of state capitalism, which Adorno participates during this period. Adorno's exile also sees, once Adorno had laid important groundwork with his reflections on class theory, the genesis of Dialectic of Enlightenment, co-authored with Max Horkheimer, followed by Minima Moralia. These texts are placed within the development of Adorno's critique of political economy, alongside 3 conversations in which Adorno and Horkheimer affirm the political content of their critical theory. The third and most actively theoretical part of this study engages with Adorno's return to the critique of economy following his move back to Frankfurt in the post-war period. Adorno's renewed engagement with Marx during this time stands at the center of his work on the philosophy he would ultimately propound in Negative Dialectics. It is in this work that Adorno arrives at a concept of economy, which refers to the relationship between nature and society on the one hand, and to the relationship of society to itself on the other. The critique of economy, understood in this way, ultimately gestures towards the utopia of a humanity no longer fated to languish under economic coercion. All right, so that's the end of Chapter 1 of Adorno's Critique of Political Economy by Dirk Braunstein, translated by Adam Baltner. Thanks for listening.